Pay attention to this. October 14th. Dubai. The Burj Al Arab Jumeirah. A wedding night. A man and his new bride check into a suite that costs more per night than most people earn in a year. She is 26 years old. A Filipina woman who built everything she has from nothing. He is 41. The third son of a family worth $4 billion. At 11:31 p.m., she makes a phone call. For minutes. 17 seconds. At 11:34 p.m., he gets back in the elevator. The call is still running. At 11:35 p.m., the hallway camera catches him walking through the door, stopping just inside it, standing completely still. 11 seconds. Not moving. At 1:47 a.m., a maintenance worker on an outdoor scaffold looks through the panoramic window. He sees something in the private pool. He reaches for his phone. But here is what nobody in that building knew. Not the hotel, not the police, not the man already standing at the window looking down at the water. The maintenance worker was wearing a body camera. It had been running since 10 p.m. Caught everything. She called her ex to say goodbye, to tell him she was happy, to give him closure. He walked in during the last 30 seconds. And what he did next took a $4.3 billion machine, a hidden CCTV directory, and a lawyer called before an ambulance to try to bury. It didn't work. Her name was Mayumi Bayani, 26 years old, from Cebu City in the Philippines. Before you know what happened to her, you need to know who she was, because the temptation with stories like this one. A young Filipina woman, a wealthy Arab man, a luxury hotel, a tragedy, is to flatten the victim into a symbol, to let her exist only in relation to the man who killed her, only as the thing that was lost, only as the lesson at the end. That is not what Mayumi Bayani was. That is not what she would have allowed herself to be. She had spent 26 years refusing to be flattened by circumstances far more powerful than any story, and she deserves the same refusal here. So let's start at the beginning. Mayumi was the second of 4 children born to Dolores and Rodrigo Bayani in a 2-bedroom house in a barangay in the northern part of Cebu City. Dolores taught 3rd grade at a public elementary school for 31 years. Rodrigo drove a tricycle, the small motorcycle and sidecar combination that serves as taxi, delivery vehicle, and lifeline in the neighborhoods of the Philippine provinces. 6 days a week, every week, for as long as his children could remember. They were not poor in the way that word gets used carelessly in Western writing about people from Southeast Asia. They were poor in the specific, structural, very real way that means every decision in the household carries a cost, and every cost has a face, and the face it most often wears is the face of what the children will not get to do. Between them, Dolores and Rodrigo made sure none of the children went hungry and all of them went to school. That was the foundation. Mayumi built the rest herself. She was, by every account of every person who knew her, the one who noticed things. Not in a dramatic way, not the one who sensed danger or read rooms for threat. The one who noticed what people needed before they said it out loud. Who noticed when her younger sister Mara was struggling with a subject and sat with her without being asked. Who noticed when a classmate was eating alone and joined them without making it a thing. Her teachers described her as unusually perceptive. Her friends described her more simply, as someone who paid attention. She paid enough attention to understand, early and clearly, what leaving would cost and what staying would cost more. At 22, Mayumi Bayani came to Dubai on a domestic worker visa. She had 4,300 Philippine pesos in her pocket, roughly $75 at the time, and a phone number for a cousin of a cousin who knew a woman in Dubai who could help her find work. She found it within a week. Hotel housekeeping at a 3-star property near the Gold Souk in Dera. 8-hour shifts, sometimes 10. 6 days a week. She shared a room with 2 other Filipino women, one from Iloilo and one from Davao, both of whom she stayed close to for years afterward. She sent 60% of every paycheck home to Cebu from the first month. Not 50. Not when she could afford it. 60%. Every month. Without exception. She built that number into her budget the way other people build in rent, as a fixed cost, the first line on every calculation before anything else was counted. Because complaining was not the plan. The plan was the degree. She enrolled in an online business administration program run through a Philippine university while working full-time in Dubai. She studied on her phone during breaks. She submitted assignments at midnight after double shifts, her device propped against a water bottle on the shared kitchen table while her roommates slept. When people asked how she found the time, her best friend Maribel, who would later give one of the most widely quoted statements of the entire trial, said simply, "She didn't find it. She made it. That's different." Mayumi graduated 3 years later. A 3.8 grade point average. No ceremony. The certificate arrived by post to her parents' address in Cebu because she had nowhere to hang it in Dubai that felt like hers yet. By the time it arrived, she was already applying for the next position. She had not paused to celebrate. She had already identified the gap. By 25, she was a guest relations coordinator at a 5-star property in Dubai's International Financial Center. She wore a blazer to work every day. She spoke 4 languages fluently: Cebuano, Filipino, English, and Arabic, the last of which she had spent her 3rd year in Dubai teaching herself, because she had understood something that took most expatriates a decade to figure out. In Dubai, the language of power is Arabic and the language of survival is English, and if you want to exist somewhere between those two, if you want to be someone the system cannot fully ignore, you need both, and you need to speak them without an apology in your voice. She remembered every regular guest's birthday. She learned the difference between what people asked for and what they actually needed. She was good at her job in the way that comes not from training but from paying attention, which Mayumi had been doing her whole life. She sent 60% of every paycheck home to Cebu every month. Still, her younger sister Mara was in her 2nd year of nursing school, the tuition paid entirely by Mayumi's remittances. When Mara called to thank her, Mayumi told her to focus on her studies. When their mother Dolores called to say she was proud, Mayumi said, "Wait until I'm actually done." She didn't know yet what done looked like. She just knew the direction. She met Fisel Alrashidi at a charity gala in February of that year. He was one of several dozen Emirati and Gulf Arab attendees. She was there in a professional capacity, managing hospitality logistics for the event on behalf of her property. The encounter was brief and, by the standards of a busy event floor, unremarkable, except that he came back to find her afterward, while the tables were being cleared, and asked for her card. She had heard that opening before. She gave him the card. He called the following week, not to arrange anything professional, just to talk. And here is the thing that Maribel described later, the thing that set this apart from the half-dozen. Similar calls Mayumi had deflected in 4 years of working in Dubai's hospitality world. He listened, not in the performative way of a man waiting for a pause so he can speak again, in the way of someone genuinely interested in what she was saying. He asked about Cebu. He asked about her degree, and when she told him about studying on her phone at midnight in a shared kitchen, he did not perform admiration or pivot quickly to something more comfortable. He asked a follow-up question. He wanted to know more. She wasn't used to that, Maribel told investigators. And I think that mattered more than anything else about him. She heard it and was honest with herself about how much it mattered, because that's who she was. She didn't pretend things weren't true. The relationship that developed over the next 7 months was necessarily discreet. It had to be. A man of Fisel Alrashidi's family standing and a woman of Mayumi's background conducting an open courtship in Dubai would have generated the kind of social friction that neither of them needed. He was from a world where such relationships were managed carefully. She was from a world where she had always understood that the rules applied differently to people with less, and she had long since stopped being surprised by that particular asymmetry. They navigated it the way she navigated everything. Practically, without self-pity, with her eyes fully open. His family knew he was seeing someone. They did not know her name. His driver knew when to be at her building and when to circle the block. Her colleagues knew she was seeing someone but not who. That arrangement suited both of them for a while. She told her mother. She told Maribel. Those were the only 2 people who knew everything. Maribel said, "Be careful." She heard it. She was careful. She asked questions that other women in her situation might not have thought to ask, about his previous marriage, about his family's expectations, about what exactly he was offering and what he understood it would require. She took nothing on faith and nothing at face value, because 26 years of building her own life had made her constitutionally incapable of that. She was careful. And then in the back of a black car on Sheikh Zayed Road one September evening, with the city rising on both sides and the lights going on forever, Fisel told her he wanted to marry her. She asked for 2 weeks to think. She called her mother that night. Dolores cried in the way that mothers cry when they receive news too large to process immediately, not with clear grief or clear joy, but with the overwhelming weight of all possible futures colliding at once. They talked for almost an hour. Dolores asked every question a mother asks. Mayumi answered everyone honestly. She called Maribel the following day. Maribel went quiet for a long moment and then said, "Do you love him?" Mayumi said yes. Maribel said, "Then be more careful." Mayumi thought about it for 14 days. She weighed everything she had built against everything being offered. She thought about what it would mean for her family, for Mara's tuition, for the trajectory she had been on since she left Cebu at 22. She thought about whether this was the thing she had been working toward or the thing that would redirect it entirely. She said yes. The Nika ceremony was held on the evening of October 14th. Private. 12 guests. A Sheikha officiant. A hotel ballroom in Jumeirah dressed simply, white flowers, low lighting, nothing extravagant, which was apparently Mayumi's preference. She wore white. Her hair was pinned. Her hands, in every photograph taken that evening, were completely steady. She looked like a woman who had considered every angle and made her decision and was at peace with it. Fisel moved her into the royal suite at the Burj Al Arab the same night. The suite cost approximately $4,700 per hour. At the peak of her housekeeping career, Mayumi had earned roughly that amount in a month. She stood on the terrace in her wedding clothes and looked out at the Gulf. The water was dark and enormous, and the lights of the city curved away on both sides like arms. She called her mother. The call lasted 11 minutes. Dolores kept saying her name. Mayumi kept saying the same thing back. "I'm okay, Mama. I'm okay." That call ended at 11:14 p.m. 17 minutes later, she made another one. Before you hear what happened on that terrace, you need to understand something about the phone call. Because the phone call is the hinge of this entire story, the thing that was used to frame everything that followed, the thing that Fisel's legal team would later point to, the thing that certain corners of the internet would pick up and carry and twist into something it fundamentally was not. So let's be precise about what it was. It was an act of kindness. That is it. That is the complete description. Full stop. Liwanag de la Cruz was 27 years old. He lived in Cebu City. He had been Mayumi's boyfriend for just over 2 years. A relationship built on daily calls between his apartment near the IT park and her shared room in Dara, on shared ambitions, on the specific tenderness of two people from the same city who had found each other in the strange, suspended life of young adults who were not yet where they were going. He was a call center supervisor. He was funny by all accounts. He was kind. He loved her in the straightforward, uncomplicated way of someone who had never needed to perform it. The relationship had ended when the distance became too much, not because either of them wanted it to, but because Dubai had stopped being temporary for Mayumi, and the gap between where she was going and where he was had grown from a distance into a divergence. They ended it without anger. They stayed in occasional contact afterward. A message here, a call there, nothing sustained, the kind of connection that exists between people who were once genuinely important to each other and have not been fully able to close it. Which is not a flaw in either of them. It is just what it is. It is ordinary. The last call before October 14th had been 4 months earlier. A brief check-in. Nothing significant. He did not know she was engaged. He did not know she was married. He did not know anything about Fisel Alrashidi or the royal suite or the Nika ceremony that had taken place in Jumeirah just hours before. He was at home in Cebu City when his phone rang. He answered because the number was Mayumi's, and he always answered when it was Mayumi's. When investigators from the Philippine National Bureau of Investigation reached him 5 days after Mayumi's death, he gave his account of the call in full, voluntarily, without a lawyer, because he had nothing to hide and nothing to protect except the truth of what she had said. His statement was entered into the case record and referenced in the prosecution's closing argument. This is what he described. She had called to tell him she was married. She wanted him to hear it from her directly, rather than find out some other way, some other time, in some way that would be worse. She said she was happy. She told him he should move on. She said, and this is the line that Liwanag delivered to investigators in a tone that multiple people later described as quiet, controlled, and completely devastating. She said, I just needed you to know I'm okay. That was the call. For minutes, 17 seconds, a woman on her wedding night, in a city far from home, taking the time to give a man she had once loved the specific kindness of a clean goodbye. Not because she owed it to him, not because she was ambivalent about her new life, not because there was anything unresolved between them, but because she was the kind of person who did not leave things painful when she had the ability to close them properly. Because she had been paying attention her whole life, and she understood that the people who had loved you deserved to know when the chapter ended. And she was generous enough to tell them. That is who she was. That is the complete context of the phone call. Hold that. At 11:23 p.m., the suite's private elevator camera recorded Fisel Alrashidi departing the royal suite level. The elevator log confirmed it. He had told Mayumi he was going to the reception desk. Something about a catering arrangement for the following morning's breakfast. A small errand. He'd be back shortly. The trip, per the elevator log, took 11 minutes from departure to return. 11:23 p.m. Suite elevator. Fisel Alrashidi departs. Confirmed. At 11:31 p.m., Mayumi made the call. 8 minutes after Fisel left. She waited until she was alone. Not because she was hiding something, the call itself makes that impossible to argue. But because this was a private moment, a personal one, and she was a woman who understood the difference between what belonged to a marriage and what belonged to the interior life she had built entirely on her own. The call to Liwanag was hers. It was not a secret. It was simply not his business. 11:31 p.m. Mayumi's phone. Outgoing call placed to Cebu city number. Contact name, Liwanag. At 11:34 p.m., the elevator log recorded something nobody inside the suite knew. Fisel Alrashidi had returned to the suite level. 3 minutes. The errand had taken 3 minutes. The call was still running. 11:34 p.m., suite elevator. Fisel Alrashidi returns to suite level. Logged. 11:34 p.m., Mayumi's call. Still active. Approximately 3 minutes remaining. The suite's entrance hallway camera, one of the cameras that would, within the hour, be moved to a hidden directory by the hotel's head of security, and that would not be recovered until a formal judicial order forced its production 3 days later, recorded what happened next with complete and indifferent precision. 11:35 p.m., suite entrance hallway. Fisel Alrashidi enters. Stops. He stopped just inside the entrance. Not because something was blocking his path. Not because he had dropped something or needed to check his phone. He stopped because he could hear something. Not the call itself. Not the words, not the voice on the other end. But the unmistakable sound of his wife's voice, low and warm, speaking in Cebuano. The way a person speaks when they are talking to someone from home. Someone they have known for a long time. Someone they are comfortable with in a way that has nothing to do with the room they are standing in. He stood there, not moving. 11 seconds. 11 seconds is not a long time in the abstract. It is the length of a deep breath held and released. It is the time it takes to read 2 sentences. But in the context of what came next, what the cameras recorded over the hour that followed, what the medical examiner would later document, what a body camera on a scaffold would capture at 1:47 a.m., 11 seconds is an eternity. It is the space between a thought and a decision. It is the last moment in which something else was still possible. The call ended at 11:35 p.m. Liwanag de la Cruz, at home in Cebu City, heard her say "I'm okay," and then the line went quiet, and then there was a soft sound he could not quite identify, and then nothing. He thought it was a dropped connection. He held the phone for a moment, then set it on his nightstand and lay back in the dark and tried to decide how he felt about a conversation that had just, in 4 minutes and 17 seconds, closed a door on 2 years of his life. He did not call back. There was nothing left to say. She had said it all. He did not know that she had not hung up the phone. He did not know the call had ended because Fisel Alrashidi had crossed the room. 11:35 p.m. Mayumi's call ends. Duration 4 minutes, 17 seconds. 11:36 p.m. Suite hallway camera. Fisel moves toward interior. 11:41 p.m. Movement toward terrace corridor. 11:44 p.m. Terrace door opens. The terrace approach camera, recovered 3 days later from the hidden directory, intact, unaltered, every second preserved, showed the door opening at 11:44 p.m. and remaining open. No one else entered or exited the suite through the main entrance for the rest of the night. The door to the terrace stayed open. 11:44 p.m. to 1:47 a.m. Terrace door open. No exit through main entrance. No emergency call placed. 63 unbroken minutes. Between 11:44 p.m. and 1:47 a.m., Fisel Alrashidi made exactly 0 phone calls. Not to the hotel emergency line. Not to the front desk. Not to a doctor or a paramedic or any of the 1,600 staff members of the Burj Al Arab who are trained specifically for guest medical emergencies and could have been at that suite within 90 seconds of a single call. Not one call. Not to anyone. He did not call for help. He did not call because he already knew what was in that pool. He had known since 11:44 p.m. Mayumi Bayani had stood on that same terrace earlier in the night in her wedding clothes and felt the enormity of it. The water, the city, the life she had built that had somehow led here, to this night. She had made one small act of kindness before the night was over. One phone call. 4 minutes and 17 seconds to give a good man a clean ending. It was the last call she ever made. At 1:47 a.m., the answer to what happened in that suite between 11:44 p.m. and the moment the maintenance worker looked through the glass was not going to come from inside the hotel. It was going to come from a scaffold on the western face of the building. It was going to come from a man in a chest harness wearing a second-hand camera, doing a job that no one at the Burj Al Arab had ever thought to account for. It was going to come from the one place that the $4 billion machinery of Fisel Alrashidi's protection had never thought to look. His name has never been publicly released. In every official document, every case filing, every line of the prosecution's 41-page evidence record, he appears as a single designation, Witness A. He was a contracted maintenance worker, not an employee of the Burj Al Arab Jumeirah, not a member of the 1,600 staff that the hotel's management counted as theirs. He was contracted, employed by the exterior cleaning company that held the building maintenance agreement for the property, the kind of arrangement that luxury hotels in Dubai use to separate the gleaming face of the brand from the people whose labor maintains it. The distinction matters. It matters because of what it meant for how he moved through that building, what he had access to, what he was permitted to know, and what he understood about his own position within the hierarchy of a place like the Burj Al Arab. He understood it very clearly. On the night of October 14th, he was assigned to the suspended scaffold crew working the building's western face. The western face is the side that looks out over the Arabian Gulf. It is the side that the hotel's architects designed to be seen from the water. The iconic sail shape, the curved glass, the floors stacked upward, toward the sky. It is also the side whose floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows look directly into the hotel's most exclusive suites. The royal suite, the presidential suite, the suites that cost more per night than the contracted maintenance workers who cleaned the outside of their windows would earn in several years of continuous employment. He had been working this crew for 2 years. He knew the building the way people know things they have worked around in the dark, not with admiration, but with the practical, unglamorous intimacy of someone who has memorized every bolt, every cable anchor, every wind pattern at every level, because that knowledge is the difference between a safe shift and an incident report. He had started wearing the GoPro chest mount after a safety incident in his first year on the crew. It is worth spending a moment on this, because it is the detail that changes everything. A colleague had slipped on the scaffold during a routine pass. The incident report had been contested by the company. The worker's account of what had caused the slip did not match the company's account, and without footage, the company's account was the one that went into the record. The worker had watched that process unfold and had understood something with the clarity that comes from being on the wrong side of a power imbalance. When something goes wrong at this level of the industry, in this city, in this legal environment, the person with the least institutional standing needs the most documentation. Not the most witnesses. Not the most vocal allies. Documentation. Footage. The kind of evidence that exists independent of who is telling the story. So he had gone to a second-hand electronics shop in Al-Quaz, a neighborhood in the industrial interior of Dubai, where workers buy things they cannot afford to buy new, and he had purchased a GoPro chest mount for 140 dirhams, roughly $38. He attached it to his work harness before every shift. His employer did not require it. No policy mandated it. No one had told him to do it, and no one had told him not to. He wore it because the alternative was being unprotected in the specific way that workers at his level are unprotected, not physically but evidentially. He wore it because he had learned that documentation was the only armor available to him. On the night of October 14th, he had been on shift since 10 p.m. The body camera had been running continuously from the moment he clocked in. It had recorded 2 hours and 47 minutes of footage before the scaffold reached the level of the Royal Suite's panoramic window at 1:47 a.m. 2 hours and 47 minutes of the western face of the Burj Al Arab at night, the Gulf below, the city lights on the horizon, the glass panels moving past as the scaffold tracked its lateral path across the building. Routine footage, the kind that would normally be reviewed by no one, stored briefly on the device's memory card, and eventually overwritten. Except that, at 1:47 a.m. something happened that meant this footage would not be overwritten. At 1:47 a.m., the scaffold reached the level of the Royal Suite's panoramic window, and the worker looked through the glass. He was not looking deliberately. He was doing his job, tracking the scaffold's lateral movement, monitoring the rig, checking the cable tension on the far anchor. The suite's terrace was at eye level as the scaffold passed, and the terrace lights were on, and the private infinity pool was fully illuminated, and what was in that pool was visible from where he was standing with a clarity that required no interpretation, no second look, no moment of uncertainty about what he was seeing. He stopped the scaffold. He looked again. He stood there for a moment that the body camera recorded and that would later be reviewed by investigators, by the prosecution, by the defense, and by the judge, all of whom would note the same thing. The worker did not hesitate. He did not look away and look back. He did not talk himself out of what he was seeing. He saw it, he confirmed it, and he reached for his phone. The body camera recorded 23 seconds of footage between the moment he first looked through the glass and the moment his call connected to his supervisor. 23 seconds that showed, through the panoramic window, the surface of the private pool and what was in it. 23 seconds that, in the context of the trial that would follow, became among the most significant pieces of evidence in the entire case. But what made those 23 seconds truly decisive was not the pool. It was what was visible behind the pool. Through the same glass, in the lit interior of the royal suite behind the terrace, the body camera captured something that the worker himself had not consciously registered in those first seconds. Something that the prosecution's forensic team identified when they reviewed the footage frame by frame, 3 days after the night it was recorded. A figure, standing at the interior window, looking out at the pool, not moving, not running, not picking up a phone, not doing any of the things that a person does in the first seconds after discovering that someone they love is in the water and is not moving. Not any of those things, just standing, still, oriented toward the pool, watching it with the particular quality of absolute stillness that belongs to someone who has not just arrived at that window, someone who has been standing there for a while. The glass reflection degraded the image. The distance between the scaffold and the interior of the suite was significant. The camera angle was not optimized for what it was capturing. The figure could not be identified from the footage alone. The prosecution acknowledged this early and clearly and moved on, because the footage's value was not in identifying the figure. The figure's identity was established by every other piece of evidence in the case. The footage's value was something else entirely. Its value was the timestamp, 1:47 a.m., the pool, the figure at the window, watching, not moving, not calling. The worker called his supervisor at 1:49 a.m. His supervisor, a man who had also learned that documentation was the only armor available to him in this industry, took the call seriously and immediately. He called hotel security at 1:51 a.m. Hotel security contacted Dubai police at 1:52 a.m. What happened in the next 23 minutes inside the Burj Al Arab Jumeirah had nothing to do with helping Mayumi Bayani. At 1:53 a.m., 1 minute after Dubai police were contacted, while they were still in transit, while the first responders were still calculating their route to the property, the hotel's head of security received a phone call on his personal mobile. He had worked at the Burj Al Arab for 11 years. He had been in the hospitality security industry in Dubai for 19. He understood without needing a written policy or an explicit instruction the precise nature of his obligations to guests at the level of the Alrashidi family. He understood what the semi-permanent reservation of the royal suite meant. He understood what $180,000 per month meant in terms of the relationship between that family and this property. He understood, with the complete and unspoken clarity of someone who has spent 19 years learning which guests require what kind of handling, that a call coming through on his personal mobile at 1:53 a.m. regarding the royal suite was a call that required a specific response. He did not say in testimony who called him. He was asked directly. He declined to answer directly. He said only that the instruction he received was to hold the footage pending legal review. He did not delete the files. Deletion was too crude, too detectable, too permanent. Instead, between 1:52 a.m. and 2:15 a.m., while Dubai police were making their way to the hotel, while the scaffold worker was giving his account to his supervisor in a stairwell 2 floors below the royal suite, while Mayumi Bayani Alrashidi lay in the private pool on the terrace of a suite that cost $180,000 a month to reserve, the head of security sat at his workstation and moved files. The suite entrance hallway camera, the terrace approach camera, the private elevator interior camera. He paused their automatic 30-day retention cycles and transferred the relevant files to a separate directory, one that existed within the hotel's server infrastructure, but that was not accessible through the standard evidence request pathway. The directory that an investigating officer would reach through normal channels would show those cameras as having experienced a technical issue. The files themselves would appear to be unavailable. They would not be gone. They would simply be somewhere that a standard investigation request would not find them. He did all of this in 23 minutes. He did not know about the body camera on the scaffold outside. He did not know that a man wearing a second-hand GoPro bought for 140 dirhams had been recording the western face of the building since 10 p.m. He did not know that the same footage that showed Mayumi in the pool also showed a figure standing at the interior window at 1:47 a.m., watching her. He did not know that Witness A would arrive at the police station the following morning with the camera still attached to his work harness, and that he would hand it to the officer taking his statement, and that the footage would be in the case file before the sun rose on October 15th. He did not know any of this. And so, in the careful, practiced, institutionally fluent way of someone who has spent 11 years understanding what certain guests require, he moved the files and closed the directory and went back to managing the arrival of Dubai police at the hotel service entrance. He thought he had handled it. He had not handled it. At the same moment the head of security was moving files, Fisel Alrashidi was making his first phone call since 11:35 p.m. Not to Dubai police. Not to the hotel emergency line. Not to the front desk, not to a doctor. Not to any of the 1,600 trained staff members who could have reached that suite within 90 seconds of a single call. Not to his driver. Not to a family member who might have offered comfort or clarity or any of the things people reach for in a genuine emergency. His first call was placed at 1:49 a.m. to his family's chief legal counsel. The call lasted 6 minutes and 40 seconds. He called hotel security at 1:56 a.m. 1:47 a.m. Body camera. Figure at interior window. Watching pool. Not moving. Not calling. 1:49 a.m. Faisal's phone. Outgoing call to family legal counsel. Duration 6 minutes, 40 seconds. 1:52 a.m. Hotel security contacts Dubai police. 1:53 a.m. Head of security receives call on personal mobile. 1:53 a.m. to 2:15 a.m. CCTV files moved to hidden directory. 1:56 a.m. Faisal's phone. Outgoing call to hotel security. 2:31 a.m. Mayumi Bayani Alrashidi pronounced dead at scene. The medical examiner's report estimated that Mayumi had been in the water for a minimum of 60 minutes before she was found. The revised post-autopsy finding placed her time of death between 12:02 a.m. and 12:45 a.m. The terrace door had opened at 11:44 p.m. He had known for somewhere between 62 minutes and 1 hour and 23 minutes before he called anyone with the power to help her. His first call, when he finally made one, went to the person whose job it was to protect him. Not the person who could have saved her. Mayumi Bayani Alrashidi was pronounced dead at 2:31 a.m. She was 26 years old. She had been a wife for less than 3 hours. She had called her mother from that terrace earlier in the evening and said I'm okay 11 minutes in a row until her mother believed her. She had made one small, kind phone call to a man she used to love, for minutes and 17 seconds to give him a clean goodbye, and then she had put the phone down and her husband had walked through the door, and the body camera of a man in a chest harness on the outside of the building had recorded the rest. That camera, a second-hand device bought for 140 dirhams by a man who understood that the only armor available to him was documentation, is the reason this case exists. Is the reason the files that were moved to a hidden directory were ever recovered. Is the reason the 41 pages of forensic timeline that Lieutenant Amira Khalid filed to the Public Prosecution Office 11 days later had a spine to build on. 140 dirhams. $38 against a $4.3 billion machine that had already been making its first calls. Lieutenant Amira Khalid was assigned to the case at 6 a.m. on October 15th. She was 38 years old. She had been with Dubai police for 14 years, the last 6 of them in a forensic reconstruction role that had taken her through cases involving a sitting municipal official, a British developer whose family had retained international legal counsel before the body had been removed from the scene, and a Jordanian businessman whose connections to 3 separate government ministries had made every preliminary interview feel like a diplomatic negotiation. She had a conviction rate of 81% in contested trials, a figure that her colleagues cited often and that she herself never mentioned, because she understood that the cases that mattered were never the ones where conviction was certain going in. She was known within her unit for one operational habit that distinguished her from almost every investigator she had worked alongside in 14 years. Before she opened a case file, before she reviewed a single piece of evidence, before she formed a single preliminary theory, she asked one question. Who told us to handle this carefully? And why? Her supervisor called her at 5:47 a.m. He told her she had been assigned a case at the Burj Al Arab. He told her the victim was a 26-year-old Filipina woman. He told her the suspect was Fisel Alrashidi. He told her, and he used this word specifically, deliberately, in the careful way of someone who understood that the word carried its full weight, to handle it carefully. She asked why. He said it again. Handle it carefully. She said she understood. She took the case. She did not handle it carefully in the way he meant. She arrived at the Burj Al Arab at 7:30 a.m., and she did what she always did first in a scene where she suspected evidence had been managed before her arrival. She looked at what was missing, not what was present, not the information that had been prepared for her, organized and laid out in the way that hotel security departments organize information when they want to appear cooperative while controlling the frame. She looked at the gaps, the silences, the places where something should have been and was not. The gap was immediate and large. In a hotel with over 400 CCTV cameras covering every corridor, every elevator bank, every lobby and service area and exterior approach, the evidence package she had been provided contained no footage from the Royal Suite's associated cameras. Not the entrance hallway camera. Not the terrace approach camera. Not the private elevator interior. Not a single frame from the 3 cameras that would have captured everything relevant to the question of what had happened in that suite between 11:35 p.m. and 1:47 a.m. They were not listed as malfunctioning. They were not listed as offline due to a technical fault. There was no incident report documenting a system issue, no maintenance log noting a failure, no technical notation of any kind. They were simply absent from the package, present in the building's camera inventory, absent from the evidence. The specific, deliberate absence of footage that should have existed and had been made not to exist, in the particular way that things are made not to exist by people who understand how evidence systems work and where the retrievable and the irretrievable part ways. She asked the head of security at 8:15 a.m. He said the cameras had been experiencing a technical issue. She asked when the issue had begun. He said he wasn't entirely certain of the exact time. She asked him to provide the technical fault log for those 3 specific cameras. He said he would look into it and get back to her. She already knew. She did not know the precise location of the files yet. But she had been doing this for 14 years and she knew the texture of a scene that had been processed before her arrival. The over-smoothness of it, the careful blankness of staff who are not lying outright but who are performing a version of memory that has been edited in advance. She had felt that texture in other cases against other institutional walls, and she had learned that the wall itself was not the obstacle. The obstacle was finding the specific point where it had been built in a hurry. She went to what she had. Witness A's footage was already in the case file when she arrived at her desk. He had provided it at the station that morning, still in his work clothes, the GoPro still attached to his harness. She watched the 23 seconds 11 times. She watched the pool. She watched the figure at the window. She watched the timestamp. Then she took the suite layout diagram that the hotel's facilities manager had provided and she sat with both documents for 40 minutes, mapping angles, calculating positions, confirming that the figure visible in the lit interior behind the terrace was standing in the living area adjacent to the terrace door. She documented the posture in formal language, oriented toward pool, upright, no visible movement, inconsistent with discovery of emergency. And she added a note in the margin that was not in formal language at all. The note said he was watching. She spent the first day building the perimeter of what she had. Phone records from Fisel's carrier, obtained by emergency judicial order by midday. The 1:49 a.m. call to legal counsel, 6 minutes 40 seconds. The 1:56 a.m. call to hotel security. She laid those timestamps beside the body camera timestamp, 1:47 a.m., figure at window not moving, and she noted the gap. 2 minutes and 9 seconds between the documented moment of him standing at that window watching the pool and the first call he made. And that first call was not to help. It was to protect. She wrote that in the case file in plain declarative language that would survive intact into the prosecution's closing argument 6 months later. She had Mayumi's phone records, the 11:31 p.m. call, the contact name, the duration, the call still running at 11:35 p.m. when the elevator log placed Fisel back on the suite level. She had the elevator logs. She had the maintenance schedule placing Witness A's scaffold at the window level at 1:47 a.m. She had the medical examiner's preliminary estimate. She had, in outline, the complete shape of what had happened. What she did not have was the interior CCTV, and without it the outline had no structure, no timestamps to anchor the sequence, no footage to prove that the 63-minute window between 11:44 p.m. and 1:47 a.m. had unfolded the way the rest of the evidence said it had. On the third day, she filed the evidence preservation order. The filing was 4 pages long. The first 3 pages were standard judicial language. The 4th page contained a single, specific, precise detail that made the hotel's legal representative go very quiet when he read it. The exact directory path where the moved files were stored. Not a broad demand for all available footage. Not a general preservation notice covering the hotel's entire CCTV archive. The exact directory. The exact path. Named in the filing the way you name something when you have been told where it is. She has never publicly said who told her. She has said only in one post-trial interview that she did not obtain the information through any method that surprised her. Which is the answer of someone who has spent 14 years understanding that institutions are made of people, and that people, even people employed to protect other people, sometimes decide, quietly and at personal risk, that there is a limit to what they are willing to protect. Someone inside that hotel told her where the files were. The files were produced under judicial compulsion within 4 hours. She watched the recovered footage in a closed review room with 2 colleagues as witnesses. She watched Fisel enter the suite at 11:35 p.m. She watched the 11 seconds. She watched the move toward the interior, toward the terrace. The door opening at 11:44 p.m. She watched the door stay open. She watched the timestamp advance, 11:50 p.m., midnight, 12:15 a.m., 12:30 a.m., 1 a.m., 1:30 a.m., and she watched no one exit through the main entrance for 63 unbroken minutes. No emergency call registered on any hotel system. No alarm, no sound. Nothing but the door staying open and the timestamp moving forward and the silence where 63 minutes of action should have been. She watched it all and she said nothing for a long time. Then she opened her notebook. She wrote for 4 hours. The forensic timeline she produced ran to 41 pages. Every timestamp cross-referenced against every other. The elevator logs against the phone records. The phone records against the body camera footage. The body camera footage against the recovered CCTV. The CCTV against the medical examiner's revised time of death window, 12:02 a.m. to 12:45 a.m., which sat entirely inside the 63 minutes of open door and silence. 41 pages with no gap, no ambiguity, no space in which an alternative explanation could exist and breathe. She filed it to the Public Prosecution Office on October 25th. 11 days after Mayumi Biyani had stood on that terrace in her wedding clothes, looked out at the Gulf, and told her mother she was okay. Fisel Alrashidi was arrested the same afternoon. His legal team, the same counsel called at 1:49 a.m. before any emergency service was contacted, the same team that had been preparing for this moment since before Mayumi had been pronounced dead, was at the station before he arrived. He said nothing when he was brought in. He sat in the careful, practiced stillness of a man who had learned a long time ago that stillness looks like composure, and that composure, in certain rooms, looks like innocence. He had been very still at that window at 1:47 a.m. He had been very still for 11 seconds just inside the entrance at 11:35 p.m. He was very still now. But stillness leaves timestamps, and timestamps do not move to hidden directories. They do not respond to calls placed at 1:49 a.m. to family legal counsel. They do not adjust themselves out of courtesy to guests who have held semi-permanent reservations for 6 years. They simply exist, precise and permanent, in the record of what happened and when. Lieutenant Amira Khalid had 41 pages of them. She had been told to handle this carefully. She had. Here is what the prosecution of Fisel Alrashidi revealed. Not just about one man and one night, but about the architecture that assembles itself around a crime when the man who committed it has $4 billion standing behind him. Because the crime itself, by the time Lieutenant Khalid filed her 41 pages, was documented. The timestamps were clear. The body camera footage existed. The phone records said what they said. The medical examiner's revised window placed the time of death squarely inside 63 minutes of open terrace door and absolute silence. The evidence, assembled piece by piece against every institutional effort to prevent its assembly, pointed in one direction and one direction only. But evidence and justice are not the same thing. Evidence is what exists. Justice is what is done with it. And between those two things, between a 41-page forensic timeline filed by a detective who had been told to handle it carefully and the moment a verdict was read in a Dubai courtroom, stood a machinery that Fisel Alrashidi's family had been building and maintaining and deploying for a very long time. A machinery that did not operate through threats or dramatic confrontations or the kind of obvious interference that leaves its own evidence trail. It operated the way institutional power always operates at its most effective. Quietly, structurally, through the careful management of process of access of what information reaches whom and when and in what form. It began before Mayumi's body was removed from the pool. The call to legal counsel at 1:49 a.m. was not the panicked reach of a man in crisis. It was the first move of a prepared response. 6 minutes and 40 seconds of conversation conducted while his wife lay in the pool below the window he had been standing at for somewhere between 62 minutes and an hour and 23 minutes. 6 minutes and 40 seconds of conversation that, by every inference available from what followed, established the framework for everything the defense would do over the next 6 months. The accident narrative. The documentation of what the hotel's systems should and should not show. The positioning of Fisel's posture in every subsequent interaction as cooperation rather than calculation. His first public statement, released through his family's legal office 48 hours after Mayumi's death, described the night as a tragic accident. A new bride, overwhelmed by the emotion of the evening, who had gone to the private pool alone while her husband slept. A husband who had woken to find her gone and had called immediately for help. A family devastated by an incomprehensible loss. Every element of that statement was constructed to survive the evidence that was publicly known at that point, which did not yet include the recovered CCTV, which had not yet been produced under judicial order, which was still sitting in a hidden directory on a hotel server. The statement was built around the gap, around the absence of the footage that the head of security had been instructed to move. It was a statement designed to occupy the space where the evidence should have been and to fill that space with a version of events that, without the CCTV, could not be immediately disproved. What the statement did not account for was the body camera. What it did not account for was Rodrigo Bayani. Mayumi's father had been driving his tricycle in Cebu City when his youngest daughter Mara came outside to tell him that her sister was dead. He had stopped the engine and sat on the seat for a while and said nothing. Then he had gone inside and listened to the full account of what the consul's office had been told. A tragic accident, a private pool, a devastated husband, a family offering their profound condolences and their full cooperation with any inquiry. Rodrigo Bayani was a man who had driven a tricycle 6 days a week for 30 years. He had raised 4 children on the income from that tricycle and his wife's teacher's salary. He had watched his eldest daughter leave for Dubai at 22 with $75 and build something real from nothing through a combination of intelligence and complete refusal to accept what other people decided was her ceiling. He knew what his daughter was. He knew what she had been. And he knew, sitting in that kitchen in Cebu City with his wife's hand in his and his youngest daughter's face across the table, that the version of events being offered to him was not a tragedy. It was an offer. 3 days after Mayumi's death, before her body had been repatriated, before her family had been able to bring her home and hold the funeral that she deserved, a legal intermediary operating through a Manila-based firm contacted the Bayani family on behalf of a party they declined to name directly but whose identity was not difficult to infer. The offer was 8 million Philippine pesos. At the exchange rate at that time, approximately 138,000 US dollars. The offer came with conditions. A full liability waiver, releasing all parties from any legal responsibility for Mayumi's death. A non-disclosure agreement covering Dolores, Rodrigo, their children, and any party acting on their behalf or at their direction. A clause specifying that the agreement would be void if any family member made any public statement about the circumstances of Mayumi's death, cooperated with any law enforcement investigation beyond what was legally compelled, or took any legal action in any jurisdiction. The offer was designed to purchase silence before the investigation had time to build momentum, before the NBI had been contacted, before Liwanag de la Cruz had been found, before Lieutenant Khalid had obtained the judicial order naming the specific directory where the CCTV files had been hidden. It was time to arrive at the moment when the Bayani family was at their most devastated, most disoriented, most financially and emotionally vulnerable. 3 days after losing a daughter who had been the financial spine of the entire family, before the remittances stopped and the reality of that absence began to press on every practical decision. It was, in the specific calculus of the men who designed it, a reasonable offer. A generous offer even by the standards of a transaction they had conducted before in other forms. The kind of offer that, in their experience, resolved these situations. The kind of offer that the family of a Filipina domestic worker in Dubai could not realistically afford to refuse. Rodrigo Bayani refused it. He refused it without calling a lawyer. He refused it without consulting the consul's office. He refused it the same day it was offered, in a phone call that lasted less than 4 minutes, and then he drove his tricycle to the Philippine Overseas Labor Office and he started making calls. He called every consular contact he had been given when Mayumi had registered her overseas employment years earlier. He contacted the Commission on Filipinos Overseas. He called Maribel, who had a cousin in Cebu who was a practicing lawyer and who connected the family to a human rights organization with documented experience in overseas Filipino worker cases involving Gulf employers. That organization contacted a journalist who had been covering labor conditions and migrant worker rights in the Gulf for 7 years. That journalist contacted the Philippine National Bureau of Investigation's International Affairs Division. The NBI made formal contact with Lieutenant Khalid's unit on October 22, 3 days before she filed her 41-page case document. 2 days before Fisel Alrashidi was arrested. The NBI's involvement did 2 things. First, it created an international evidentiary record that ran parallel to the Dubai police investigation and could not be managed through local institutional channels. Second, and more critically for the trial, it produced Liwanag de la Cruz. The NBI located him within 5 days of being brought into the case. He was at home in Cebu City. He was not hiding. He had no reason to hide. He had been living with the weight of a phone call since the morning investigators had knocked on his door and told him that Mayumi was dead. A phone call that had lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds, that he had replayed in his mind every day since, that he had not spoken about publicly because no one had asked him, and that he would speak about fully and completely the moment anyone did. He gave his statement voluntarily. No lawyer, no conditions, no negotiation about what would and would not be included. He sat across from an NBI investigator and he described the call in the specific, unembellished detail of a man who had been carrying it in his chest for weeks and was finally putting it down. He described the time of the call and the fact that it had woken him from sleep. He described the sound of her voice. Clear, warm, steady, not distressed, not conflicted. The voice of someone who knew exactly what she was saying and why. He described the content without editorializing. She had called to tell him she was married. She wanted him to hear it from her. She was happy. She told him to move on. She said she just needed him to know she was okay. He described the moment the call ended and the silence afterward and how he had held the phone for a moment before setting it down, and how he had thought it was a dropped connection. He described all of this and then he said one more thing that was not in response to any question but that he had apparently decided he needed to say regardless. He said, "She was giving me a gift. She didn't have to call. She had already moved on. She called because she wanted me to be able to move on too. That's the kind of person she was. That's all that call was." His statement entered the case record and became, in the prosecution's hands, the instrument that dismantled every version of events the defense attempted to construct. Because the defense needed the call to be something other than what it was. They needed it to be evidence of ambivalence. Evidence of doubt about her new marriage. Evidence of a woman in emotional crisis on her wedding night, reaching back toward a previous relationship, destabilized and vulnerable and capable of the kind of impulsive, self-destructive act that a drowning in a private pool might, in the right framing, be made to resemble. The defense needed Liwanag de la Cruz to be something other than what he was. He was a 27-year-old man from Cebu City who had loved Mayumi Bayani for 2 years, and who had received a phone call from her on her wedding night in which she told him she was happy and asked him to move on and said she just needed him to know she was okay, and who had sat in front of investigators and told them exactly that without ornamentation or strategic emphasis, and whose account could not be shaken because it was simply, plainly, completely true. The defense offered 3 alternative theories for Mayumi's death during the trial. The first was accident. She had been drinking. The toxicology report found no alcohol in her system. She had gone to the pool alone while Fisel slept. The terrace approach camera showed the door opening at 11:44 p.m., with no return through the main entrance for 63 minutes. She had drowned without his knowledge. The body camera placed him at the interior window at 1:47 a.m. watching the pool without calling for help. The accident theory required the jury to disbelieve 4 separate and independent pieces of evidence simultaneously. The prosecution pointed this out in plain language. The second theory was suicide. The defense cited, without medical support, the alleged emotional difficulty of a cross-cultural marriage and what they described as unspecified personal pressures bearing on Mayumi at the time of her death. Liwanag's statement destroyed this theory before the defense finished presenting it. The toxicology report destroyed it further. No sedatives, no alcohol, no pharmacological indicator of any kind consistent with a premeditated act. The medical examiner's findings on the physical evidence were inconsistent with a voluntary submersion. 3 words from a man in Cebu City. She was happy. The jury did not deliberate long on the suicide theory. The third theory was a cardiac event, an undiagnosed congenital abnormality that had caused sudden cardiac arrest while Mayumi was in the pool. A death entirely unrelated to any action by Fisel and witnessed by a husband too shocked to call for help in the critical moments. The defense presented an expert witness in support of this theory. The prosecution presented 3 independent forensic specialists who disputed the methodology of the defense expert's analysis. The medical examiner testified that the post-autopsy findings were not consistent with cardiac arrest as a primary cause of death. The judge's written finding dismissed the cardiac theory in a single paragraph. What the prosecution had that the defense could not answer was the timeline. Not any single piece of it. The whole of it. The elevator log and the phone records and the body camera footage and the recovered CCTV and Lewenog's statement and the medical examiner's revised window and the 41 pages that laid them all out in sequence, each timestamp pressing against the next, building an account of October 14th from 11:23 p.m. to 2:31 a.m. that had no gaps, no ambiguities, no spaces where an alternative explanation could breathe. The prosecution's closing argument lasted 4 hours. The final section addressed the phone call directly. The prosecutor stood in front of the jury and said the following, in language that would be quoted in every report filed on the trial. She called her ex-boyfriend on her wedding night to tell him she was married, to tell him she was happy, to tell him she was okay. She was on the phone for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. She was not crying. She was not in distress. She was not ambivalent about her new life. She was giving a good man a clean goodbye because that is what kind people do. Her husband walked in during the last 30 seconds of that call. He stood still for 11 seconds. Then he moved toward the interior. Then he moved toward the terrace. Then the door opened. And then 63 minutes passed in which the most expensive suite in this building had no one calling for help, and a woman who had come to this city at 22 years old with $75 and built something extraordinary was in the private pool on that terrace. The prosecutor paused. Then, the defense has offered you 3 theories. Each one requires you to disbelieve something. The accident requires you to disbelieve the toxicology, the CCTV, the body camera, and the phone records simultaneously. The suicide requires you to disbelieve a man in Cebu City who received a 4-minute phone call from a woman telling him she was happy, and a medical examiner who spent 40 hours with the physical evidence. The cardiac event requires you to disbelieve 3 independent forensic specialists and explain why a man whose wife had just collapsed in a pool called his lawyer before he called for help. Another pause. We are not asking you to believe any complicated theory. We are asking you to read a timeline. The timeline reads the same way every time. The jury went out. The verdict came on a Tuesday morning. Guilty. First-degree murder. Life imprisonment. Fisel Alrashidi sat in the courtroom with the same careful, practiced stillness he had maintained throughout the proceedings. He showed no visible reaction when the verdict was read. His legal team filed notice of appeal before the afternoon was over. The machinery did not stop simply because a verdict had been delivered. It recalibrated, found new angles, continued. That is what machinery does. In Cebu City, Dolores Biani was in the kitchen when the call came from the consul's office. She had been spending a lot of time in the kitchen. It was the room where she felt closest to Mayumi, not because anything particular had happened there, but because Mayumi had always come to the kitchen first when she called home on video. She would prop her phone against something and cook or pretend to cook, and Dolores would sit at the table in Cebu and they would talk about everything and nothing, the ordinary conversation of a mother and daughter who had found their rhythm across 11,000 kilometers and a 3-hour time difference and 4 years of separation. The kitchen was where Dolores waited for things now. She was sitting at the table when the phone rang. Mara was beside her. Mara, who was in her final year of nursing school, the tuition paid by remittances that would no longer arrive, a fact that nobody in the family had addressed directly because there were larger facts sitting on top of it. Dolores answered. The consul's representative spoke. She listened to the word guilty and she did not cry. She had spent the months since October doing the work of grief in a sustained, relentless way that had moved her past the kind of crying that a verdict could trigger. She was on the other side of that now. She was in the place that comes after, where the fact of the loss is so deeply incorporated into every ordinary moment that news about it, even good news, lands as confirmation rather than revelation. She said, in Cebuano, the sentence that Mara later translated for the journalists who had gathered outside the house. It doesn't bring her back. Then she sat for a while with the phone in her lap. Outside, Rodrigo Biani was not in the kitchen. He was never in the kitchen during the day anymore. He was driving. He had been driving his tricycle every day since October because motion was the only thing that made the static, suffocating weight of what had happened possible to carry. As long as the engine was running and the streets were moving past him, he could sustain the forward momentum that grief required. Stillness was the enemy. Stillness was the kitchen. Stillness was the specific, brutal silence of a remittance that no longer came. Mara came outside to find him. She stood beside the tricycle and told him. He cut the engine. He sat on the seat with his hands on his knees and he looked at the street for a while, at the ordinary movement of the neighborhood around him, at the children and the vendors and the other tricycles threading through the afternoon, at the unremarkable continuing life of a place that did not know what his family had been through and would not pause for it regardless. He said, in the account Mara gave to a Cebu newspaper the following day. She deserved justice. She got it. She deserved more. He started the engine again and drove. Maribel, who had told Mayumi to be careful and then to be more careful, and who had carried the weight of those two pieces of advice through every day of the investigation and trial, measuring them against each other and finding in both of them a truth that could not be resolved, gave one interview after the verdict. She chose a small Filipino language publication run by an advocacy organization that worked with overseas workers. She was precise about that choice. She said she wanted what she had to say to reach the people it was meant for. She spoke for a long time. The section of her interview that was picked up internationally and translated into 6 languages and read by more people than any other statement made during the entire course of the case was this. She was not a cautionary tale. She was not a symbol. She was a woman who came to this city at 22 years old with $75 and built everything she had through intelligence and refusal. She sent 60% of every paycheck home every single month without exception. She put her sister through nursing school. She learned 4 languages because she paid attention to the world she was living in and understood what it required. She called her ex-boyfriend on her wedding night to give him closure because that is who she was. Someone who did not leave things painful when she could close them with kindness. She did everything right. She was careful and she was smart and she was good. And she is dead because a man with money decided that what was his could not have a past. And because he had spent his entire life in a world where that decision, for men like him, has no consequences. She paused in the recording. Then, the consequences arrived. They were late. They were incomplete. The appeal is already filed. But they arrived. And the reason they arrived is not because the system that was supposed to protect her worked. It didn't work. It moved to protect him. The reason they arrived is because 4 people refused. She named them. A man on a scaffold who wore a camera because he understood that documentation was the only armor available to him. A detective who was told to handle it carefully and asked why and built 41 pages of answer. A father who was offered $138,000 to be silent and drove his tricycle to the labor office instead. A man in Cebu City who sat in front of investigators and told them about a 4-minute phone call in which a woman told him she was happy and she was okay. Those 4 people, Maribel said, are the reason there was a verdict at all. The head of security who had moved the files was not prosecuted for what he did. He received a formal administrative caution from the Dubai Police Oversight Authority and resigned from the Burj Al Arab the month after the arrest. His immunity from prosecution had been conditioned on full cooperation with the investigation, which he had provided when it became clear that the directory had been found and that the alternative to cooperation was a charge he could not survive. The judge noted in his written findings that the obstruction had delayed the investigation by 72 hours, and that without the body camera footage, the hidden CCTV files might not have been located in time to be preserved for trial. He did not editorialize further. He did not need to. The finding was its own editorial. Witness A attended no press conferences. He gave no interviews. He was not present in the courtroom when the verdict was read. On the day the verdict came, he was on shift. He was on the scaffold on the western face of the building, moving the rig laterally in the standard pattern for the building's morning cleaning pass, the same scaffold he had been on the night of October 14th, wearing the same harness, the GoPro mounted to his chest and running as it ran at the start of every shift, because he had learned a long time ago that the only armor available to him was documentation, and a verdict in a courtroom he had never entered did not change that calculus. The prosecution acknowledged him in their closing argument. Not by name. His identity remained protected throughout the proceedings, but with a sentence that those who were present in the courtroom on that day described as the quietest, most deliberate sentence of the entire 4-hour closing. The truth in this case survived because one man spent 140 dirhams on a second-hand camera and wore it every night because he understood that when something goes wrong, the person with the least institutional standing needs the most documentation. It is a precise and bitter irony that the woman who died did not have access to the same protection. Lieutenant Amira Khalid was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. She had been there every day of the trial, sitting in the same seat, her case notebook open on her knee. She had watched the defense present its 3 theories. She had watched the prosecution systematically dismantle each one with documents she had assembled in a closed review room over 11 days in October. She had watched Fisel Alrashidi sit in the careful stillness of a man who had decided that stillness was composure and composure was innocence. And she had watched the jury look at him and look at the 41 pages and make their decision. When the verdict was read, she wrote something in her notebook. She closed it. She put it in her bag. She walked outside and stood in the sun for a few minutes. Then she went back to work. She has not spoken publicly about the case in detail. In one brief interview conducted after the trial concluded, she was asked how she had obtained the directory path that allowed her to name the hidden files in the judicial evidence order. She said she did not obtain it through any method that surprised her. She was asked if she had expected to be able to build the case given the institutional obstacles she faced from the first morning. She said, "I expected it to be difficult. Difficult is not the same as impossible. Those are 2 different things, and it matters that people know the difference." She was asked if she believed justice had been served. She thought about it for a moment. She said, "Justice arrived. It arrived late. It arrived incomplete. The appeal is filed and the machinery continues. It arrived at a cost that nobody should have had to pay. But the question of whether it arrived and the question of whether it was sufficient are 2 different questions, and I think it matters that we don't collapse them into each other." She got a verdict. Her family got a verdict. That is not nothing. It is also not enough. Both of those things are true at the same time. Mara Biani graduated from nursing school in the months following the trial. The nursing organization that Maribel had connected the family to during the investigation had, through a fund established by the advocacy publication that ran her interview, covered the remaining tuition that Mayumi's remittances could no longer provide. Mara wore the traditional white uniform to the graduation ceremony. She walked across the stage and received her diploma and thought about what it had cost and who had paid for it and what it meant that the person who had paid for most of it was not there to see it. Rodrigo drove her and Dolores to the ceremony in his tricycle. There is one thing that does not appear in any case document or trial record. It exists only in Liwanag de la Cruz's account of the phone call, the 4 minutes and 17 seconds placed at 11:31 p.m. on October 14th, the call that Fisel Alrashidi returned to the suite to find his wife making, the call that he heard the end of while standing 11 seconds motionless just inside the entrance door. Liwanag told investigators that in the final minute of the call, Mayumi had gone quiet for a moment, not because she was distressed, not because she had heard something, because she had moved to the window and was looking out at something and she wanted to describe it. She told him what she was seeing. The gulf at night from very high up. The water dark and enormous. The city lights curving away on both sides. Everything going on forever. She said, "It's so beautiful, Liwanag. I wish you could see it." Those were the second to last words she said to him. Her last words were, "I'm okay." Then the call ended. She was 26 years old. She had come to Dubai at 22 with $75 and built something real from nothing through intelligence and refusal and 60% of every paycheck sent home without exception. She had learned 4 languages. She had put her sister through school. She had stood on a terrace on her wedding night and looked out at the Arabian Gulf and found it beautiful and wanted to share that beauty with someone she had once loved because she was the kind of person who did not keep beautiful things to herself. She was okay. And then the door opened. And what the body camera of a man on a scaffold caught 2 hours later, and what a detective built 41 pages around, and what a father refused $138,000 to bury, and what a man in Cebu City sat across from investigators and told the truth about, all of that is why you know her name. Mayumi Biani, 26 years old. She was okay.